Good afternoon and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute, everyone. Thank you to those who made it out despite the lack of metro today, and we also welcome everyone watching on the web. We're here today to discuss how research and evidence can be used to make informed education policy decisions, and specifically, our discussion is going to revolve around the usefulness of randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, in education research. So why are we focusing on RCTs, at least in this discussion? Well, the quality of education research has not always been held in the highest regard, and in large part because of the arguably shaky research methods that have been used by some researchers in the past to evaluate interventions in schools. Perhaps in some loaded words, many have argued that education research did not do a sufficient job providing convincing evidence on what works in schools. In 2002, the Institute for Education Sciences at the Department of Education started a purposeful shift pushing research that used randomized assignment and quasi-experimental designs. And among these, randomized controlled trials were sort of at the top of the pecking order and have often been referred to as the gold standard for research. At the same time, IES started the What Works Clearinghouse, which was purposed to review research and to identify that which was credible and reliable evidence for educational interventions. By identifying this high-quality research, the What Works Clearinghouse hopes to be a place that education decision makers can go to find vetted information on evidence-based decisions. Both RCTs and What Works Clearinghouse have been designed to ensure rigorous research to a specific end, that studies will produce useful evidence. So today, Marshall Smith, or Mike Smith, will present a paper written by himself and Alan Ginsburg, his colleague, that takes a deep dive into a subset of RCTs found in the What Works Clearinghouse. And they raise some pointed questions about how useful these studies and the What Works Clearinghouse treatment of them are. They raise specific questions about the studies that they review. They also raise some broader questions about the research reviewed more broadly in What Works Clearinghouse, and still broader questions about the appropriate approach to education research and what the federal government's role in that should be. Fortunately, we not only have a fantastic paper, we also have a fantastic panel. So let me introduce the authors of the paper a little more formally and our panelists as well. Alan Ginsburg, who could not be here, but is an author on the paper, was a longtime director of the Policy and Program Studies Service at the Department of Education. He also chaired the Human Resources Development Working Group of the 21 Country Asian Pacific Economic Corporation. Alan Ginsburg was also in charge of the office that launched the first randomized controlled trials at the U.S. Department of Education program evaluations. Mike Smith is a visiting scholar from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. He's a former senior counselor to Education Secretary Arne Duncan and Director of International Affairs at the Department of Education. He's also served as Undersecretary and Acting Deputy Secretary at Ed during the Clinton administration. He is a former professor and dean at the School of Education at Stanford University and has served as a professor at the University of Wisconsin and Harvard. He's a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Our panelists today include John Easton, who currently serves as a distinguished senior fellow at the Spencer Foundation, where he leads grant programs on research, practice, and partnerships. From 2009 to 2014, he was the director of the Institute for Education Sciences at the Department of Education. Before that, Mr. Easton was executive director of the Consortium of Chicago School Research at the University of Chicago and has served on the National Assessment Governing Board, which overviews NAEP. Dr. Rebecca Maynard is a university trustee chair and professor of education at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also the president of the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness and a fellow at the American Education Research Association. From 2010 to 2012, Dr. Maynard was the commissioner of the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance at IES. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Michael Foyer is the dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at George Washington University and the president of the National Academy of Education. Dr. Foyer has served in positions at the National Research Council and National Academies. And in 2014, President Obama appointed Dr. Foyer as the head to the National Board of Education Sciences. So we have a great panel and a great paper, and before I turn it over to Mike to present his paper, I want to just give a couple of housekeeping reminders. Please, if you can, check to make sure that your cell phone is silenced so it does not interrupt. Those here and on the web are welcome to tweet questions about the event or comments. Our hashtag is hashtag RCT at AEI. The event is being live streamed and full video will be posted this evening after we conclude. We will have a question and answer session after Mike presents his paper and the panelists have a chance to respond. We invite everybody on the web and in the room. If you'd like to participate, you can do so by tweeting questions to me. That's at @Malkus. And we'll be checking those and asking a selection of them. Also, everyone is invited to stay for a reception immediately following the event. With that, I will open it up for Mike to present. Thank you.
Great. So I need to turn this on. Here we go. All right. So I want to thank you all for coming. We were joking that the RCTs are so important that if they're challenged a little bit, even the metro shuts down. And Alan is very sad that he can't be here. He had a family incident, and he's in Florida now taking care of that. And I'm particularly sorry because he did an awful lot of the work of the scholar, of digging into the issues and into the data and so on. And so he's a little bit better at that than I am. But we're asked to move quickly. I have 20 minutes for about 25 slides, so I'm going to try to move through the first 9 or 10 so fast that you won't even know it. I also want to thank AEI for printing this, for putting it together, for working on it. Nat, in particular, did a lot of work on it, and then putting together this meeting. So. With that, let me start. So, IES, What Works Clearinghouse, you all know what that is. This is why I can go through the first part very fast, I think. The key here in this line is useful. The What Works Clearinghouse is intended to provide useful information to educators to make decisions. So think useful, because that's kind of the cornerstone of what we're really analyzing. We are looking at RCTs and their product, effect sizes and so on, with the idea of saying, are these useful? Are these interpretable and useful for educators to help them make decent decisions? We're looking at two kinds of RC, not kinds, but two levels of RCTs. One that the What Works Clearinghouse accepts without qualification, and one that they do accept with the qualification. The with qualification is given for relatively minor statistical or design issues. The power of RCTs, I think you're all familiar with it. Well-designed RCTs give you a really nice, clear understanding about the difference between some sort of intervention and a control. Widely used in health sciences and so on over time. Been used in education for quite a while. It's a quote from Gilbert and Mosteller. Fred Mosteller was a quite well-known statistician. He was actually chair of 6 different departments at Harvard over time, 5 of them stat departments in different schools. Really quite extraordinary, and he was my advisor, so I tend to quote him every so often. And here he is with a statement that is kind of saying that RCTs are really important, and he believed that. Other experts at the same time, this is back 30 years or 40 years, including Donald Campbell, raised a few questions about RCTs. Concerned the use of RCTs in social experiments. And so what Campbell said was social scientists have less ability to achieve experimental isolation. Now, what does that mean? Well, imagine yourself in a laboratory doing a randomized design test on on something. You try as much as possible not to allow any intervening factors into that laboratory and into the experiment. You don't want the intervention to have an interaction with anything from the outside other than that which you've exactly explained. And if you think of social experiments, you can imagine that that's impossible. And you think of it in schools. Those of you who've taught in schools know that schools are not simple places. They're very complex places. Lots of different things are going on. People are leaving. There's all sorts of changes. There's decisions made by teachers that you can't control, et cetera, when you do this. So complex interventions is what I was just talking about. Sensitivity to local context. You have to worry about policy and practice and the way that things have been carried out. And you have the length and complexity of causal chains now. So what's the causal chain function? Well, the curriculum is there. It's going to influence the teacher somehow. It's going to influence the kids to some extent. But ordinarily, it would go from teacher to the teacher, then to the students, then to the tests, and you have this kind of line of causal actors that can all make differences and change around what kind of effect is going on. This was under the British Medical Research Council, so it's not education, but the other. Implementing a math curriculum is a complex intervention. So just think of it as a complex intervention. A little history. In 2004, the NRC, National Research Council, published a study which looked at the NSF. It was designed to look at the NSF curriculum. There weren't any NSF curriculum ready for them to look at, so they didn't do that. They just wrote a report on what they should have looked at. They also got involved a little bit with the WWC evaluation because the chairman of the NRC panel actually wrote a short article that critiques the evaluation criteria. So our study comes back to the NRC study in 2004. We used a number of the kind of threats, what we call threats, to the integrity of the RCT that came out of the 2004 work of the NRC. Study design. So now we can get into it. So we are looking at threats to the integrity of the effect size. That is, you're really trying to look and see, does this say anything to us? How do we understand and explain it? So in this particular case, if you look at RCT math curriculum reports, we use the original study that's on the web, if it was on the web. Otherwise, we just took it from the WWC. So we start with WWC, go to the other studies, and then dig down into it and try to figure out what actually was going on. And we having named threats, having designed threats, we then looked to see whether or not the particular RCT is threatened by those threats. Okay, there are 27 RCTs. We took all of the RCTs that looked at math curricula in December of 2014. So we took the entire population. We didn't cherry pick the good ones or the bad ones. We took the whole thing. There are 23 individual RCTs. Some of them had multiple curriculum, and there are 16 different curricula. Some of them there were multiple studies. So think of it as 27 RCT studies. They're not totally independent of each other, but we're not making statistical analyses and so on. All right. thinking of threats now, take a look. First, we can think about 18 threats. And if you look at this, 3 of the threats are not addressed by either the WWC or by us. One of them is whether or not there's strong theory backing the intervention. These threats are real and should be thought of, and we could have included them, but we decided not to for a variety of reasons. The second one is replication. And you'll see this asked for over and over and over. A randomized design is only one little sample point, and if you replicate it, then you're going to double the possibility that you're getting usable information. And it doesn't talk about the blindness. It doesn't talk about either a single blind or a double blind study. A single blind study might be that the people who are in the study, the subjects don't know that they're in a study, and the teacher doesn't know, in the case of RCTs of math curricula. And a double blind might be not just the people in the study knowing it, but also the investigator really not knowing which is the control group and which isn't the control group, because you can have all sorts of effects of investigators on the control group. There are 3 areas that are really important that are covered by the WWC: the sampling, the statistical stuff, and attrition, issues of attrition. Those are covered, and it's the other 12 that we're really looking at. So looking at these other 12, we have 4. 4 of them are up to the WWC to make a decision about. They're under the WWC control. Those are the top 4. The WWC does not now report by each grade when there are multiple grades in a math curriculum study. Occasionally it'll reference one of them, but as a practice, it doesn't tell you what's going on in each grade. It does a summary. It doesn't report student interactions which happen within the data and are in the original report. So it doesn't let you know that that this particular intervention is working better for poor kids than it is for well-to-do kids, for example. It doesn't give you that information. That's really valuable information for somebody to make a decision about. Teacher interactions are the same way. Doesn't say whether or not this teacher who's really used to a didactic approach does well with this particular intervention, while a teacher with a more problem-oriented, a more child-oriented approach doesn't do well with it. That's important too, because then you need to understand how the training should occur. Another one's a curriculum out of date. A large number of the curriculum on the website now, or were in 2014 in December, were really out of date. They were published before the year 2000. They had been replaced. And some of them, at least one that I can recall, just wasn't published any longer. So this is useful information to know that if the particular intervention is out of date. On the other 8, developer association, that means that the developer was associated with the particular experiment somehow, and you can imagine how you could leak in different kinds of interest in that. First year implementation, as you'll see, 23 out of 27 studies were done in the first year of implementation. The average amount of time was 1 day of teaching the teachers, training the teachers by the curriculum group before school, and then 4 to 6 hours in every 4 to 6 weeks after the year had started. And the second area was in groups of people, fairly large groups of people. So there's not a heck of a lot of professional development that goes on in these. And if you think of the first year, if any of you have been teachers, think of the first year of your instruction of a program, you know that you did better the second year. You understand it, you can handle it in a much better way. All right, I'm going to speed up now. Direct measures showing fidelity, we'll talk about that one. The comparison is not identified. Turns out that the comparison group is just as important or even more important in many cases than the intervention group in getting the effect size. The effect size is the difference between the comparison and the intervention scores, or whatever the output is that you're measuring. And if you don't know what the comparison is, you don't really know how to explain the intervention. Just as an example, if you do the same experiment, the same intervention in a very well-to-do community and another one in a not so well-to-do community, and another of the same type in the not-to-do community, and you get different results. Surprise, surprise, right? But often you don't take that into consideration. You don't say in poor communities it doesn't work, or in rich communities it does work, and so on. So that the comparison group has to be totally understood in order to make a reasoned argument about the integrity of the effect size. Comparison's not equivalent dosage. Well, you'll see a couple of examples of this. One example is that particular curriculum was taught 20% more time than any of the curriculum that it was compared to. So you have if you find an effect size that's positive for that curriculum, you don't know whether it's because of the curriculum or because of the greater effect. You gonna give me how's the time? Okay. What have we got? No longitudinal data. You can understand that you'd like to know what the effect was over time of the particular intervention. Giving it for 1 year, the first year, doesn't really tell you very much about what's going to happen. Let's say it's given in the first grade. You don't know what's going to happen in the third grade or fifth grade or so on. And you can all think of curriculum that are quite different as they go through the process of first to fifth grade. Inadequate grade coverage, we thought that it was really important, particularly in elementary school, to have a couple of measures, one at least of the beginning 3 years and one at least of the final 3 years, just to get an understanding of whether or not you find big differences in those results, in order to give people some idea about what it is over time. Now, you're not doing this in a longitudinal way, but it's kind of second best to that. And finally, assessments favoring the treatment. We have situations where the assessments were designed by the curriculum developers themselves, and you can imagine that when you're in a situation like that, as comes out in very clearly in the data, that when the experiment uses a test that's designed by the developer, it does better than the test that hasn't been designed by the developer. Okay, very quick. First year implementation, I mentioned 23 out of 27. We can easily take up, in the quote from the National Research Council, you really should be looking at 3 years, they argue, under classroom teaching. Those of you know Lee Schulman, the wisdom of practice. And this has a double meaning to it, the word practice in this. What he's saying is that practice is important, that is doing it over and over, but there's also the practice of actually carrying out an activity within a classroom. That is the practice of the classroom. So it's a double meaning to it. Direct measures identify low implementation and fidelity. 6 out of 8 studies that showed low fidelity, that were reported as having low fidelity by the original investigator. These weren't reported in the WWC. You find when you compare whether or not high fidelity affects or low fidelity affects the outcomes, what you see is that it does. The average effect size here is 25. The total effect size is 33, and you can see that I believe it's 33, right? And what you can see is that the blue phase is the addition from the high fidelity. So if you're low fidelity, you're not doing very well. If you're high fidelity, you do. All right, study with very bad curriculum. You had very good curriculum outcomes. This is an outlier. I agree in the set of studies, But this is the I Can Learn curriculum. It was a year-long curriculum. They started the curriculum in the second semester. They got through 12 out of 100 lessons. Guess how they did? They did very well. They did better than any other effect size in the whole battery, 0.35 effect size. So, I don't know whether we can take this without a grain of salt, at least, and as to what actually happened. This is a really good study that was done. It compared four different curriculum. The curriculum are up here are explained. It's very hard to see that Saxon math is being compared to the four different curriculum. For example, Saxon math is being compared to investigations and math expressions and SFAW, and it's being looked at in grade 1 and grade 2. Both of these were first year implementation. They did grade 1 simultaneously with grade 2 in the study. But here's a pretty good study. You know what the comparison group is. You're pretty clear about it. What you see in this study is a difference between the kinds of, depending upon what your comparison group is or what your year is. There's a difference from 0.17, which is significant, to minus 0.5, 0.05, 0.22 size difference in that particular one. Also, in this case, it was the Saxon curriculum that spent 90 minutes a week, longer than the other curriculum. Okay, we have got to move here. Need for longitudinal experiments. This one shows the difference between, in a longitudinal experiment, on the left, the two even ones are at the beginning of the first grade, I think, or fourth grade. Is it fourth grade? And second one is the first year, and the particular curriculum with in red scored better. That was the intervention. I'm sorry, that was not the intervention. That was the control group. And in the second year of the study, in the blue, which is significantly higher than the red, that was the intervention. They reported the intervention. They didn't report the other happening. Okay, additional threat examples, developer-associated 12 of 27 studies. We've mentioned this. Assessment design, 5 of 27 studies. Out-of-date curriculum, 19 of 27 studies. What you have is a development of a lot of multiple threats. Here you've got 6 more of the threats, and we'll give you a copy of this slideshow, and it's also in the book. But you can just see that these are X of 27 different kinds of threat size, of numbers of threats. And here it is by elementary school and middle school. At the elementary school, the elementary school it's harder to have a really good low number of threats, because most of the curriculum cover 6 grades or up into 8 grades and so on. Whereas at the high school level, you also have a number of studies of algebra, and the algebra work makes it easier, as a single year. Okay, we've got 3 questions. I'm getting the 1-minute sign here when we get around to things. First question is, what are you going to do with what you've shown, and in our view, what you need to do is you need to create. You need to I'm sorry. The first question, is it possible to do this? It is possible to do it, but it costs a lot of money and takes considerable time. The second is, do you think it's a widespread beyond math curriculum? The answer is yes. It is beyond math curriculum. It's certainly to other curriculum. It probably is to other educational interventions as well. The third question is, what do we do? What are the future steps? What kind of activities are we going to have? What kinds of analyses are we going to have in order to try to better understand how we evaluate educational curricula or educational interventions and so on? So what would we do? Oh, here, this is some of Alan's magic. Makes it easier to read. Takes you a little bit of time to get through. All right. 3 actions. First actions that we ask IAS to bring together a group of experts and to work with people in the IAS and the WWC to look at all of the math curriculum, decide whether or not to get rid of them all, decide to keep many of them, whatever. But actually look really closely at them and make a judgment about whether they're useful. Do the same thing with other curriculum RCT studies. I mean, there's no reason that there's not the same problem. And I actually believe that there's no reason that this same problem doesn't exist with other kinds of educational RCTs. And, you're looking at two forms of professional development, or one form compared to none. You're looking at mentorship in one situation and no mentorship in another, or against another mentor. At least those situations are all going to be subject to the same kinds of problems that we've raised around math curriculum. So we have a fourth study. We just have 2 more slides. So we think IES should work with either the National Academy, the National Research Council, or the National Academy of Education to really begin to think about what are good evaluation and improvement processes for educational materials. How do we begin to think about those things in a serious way? And the last one is to get OMB to really think hard about this issue and not just look at the Department of Education and at WWC. They should be looking at what goes on in the Labor Department, what goes on in HHS, what goes on in HUD, and so on. Okay. We need to have a conversation about this. This is the purpose of all this, how to evaluate, understand, improve curriculum outcomes. As Yogi Berra said, however, it's often difficult. It was impossible to get a conversation going because everyone was talking too much. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Now we'll just go straight from the panel. Dr. Foyer? Dr. Easton, would you like to kick it off? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Nat, and thanks, Mike and Alan, who's not here. I'm sorry he couldn't be with us. I'm not going to do a sort of close analysis of the paper, largely because I agree with a lot of your main points. But I think it's really, really important to understand that these threats that you're noting are kind of well known right now, and that the state of the art on good RCTs really addresses them. If you looked at the IES research competition and you looked at Goal 4, you would see requirements to address all of these. So the field is really developing, and the best practices in these RTCs have changed quite a bit, improved. And there's a huge amount of attention right now, I think you probably all know this too, people looking at the heterogeneity in outcomes, people looking at mediators, mechanisms, moderators, really serious methodologists are taking these questions on. So I think the field has really moved in a way that hasn't been noted in this work. So in a way, this is kind of a straw man because we've really come a long way from there. But I want to really sort of step back and address some of the other questions about the role of the RCTs in school improvement, the role of evidence in school improvement process. And I want to start by talking about a paper that appeared in Ed Researcher a couple years ago. Heather Hill was the lead author, Heather Hill from Harvard. It was a real nice paper on talking about evaluating professional development programs. So it's like this, like the curricula, very complicated sequential sorts of things. And Heather kind of argued, and there have been many big RCT evaluations of professional development, and rarely are there effects on student outcomes. Every once in a while you see one, but not very often. So Heather and her colleagues kind of argued that sort of to flip the model and to use the RCTs very aggressively in the development stage, and instead of waiting till the end with a big summit of evaluation. So their idea is, which is probably not a new idea, but carefully test various program delivery features early on in the development to guide the program development. And while that's happening, building theory about what should work and how it works. So this idea of really investing in the development and building understanding as you go so that you build a program that's got tested components in it already, which I think is a really nice idea. That clearly generalizes beyond just professional development evaluation to any of these kind of complicated interventions. A bunch of us, most of us on this panel, a couple of weeks ago, were here in Washington at the annual meeting of the Society for Educational Research and Educational Effectiveness. And Larry Hedges, who is the former president of the organization, gave a plenary speech about some challenges that RCTs were facing right now. And the first challenge that he talked about was this lack of replication that we're seeing in lots of fields right now. And he thinks education's got to be prepared for this and do something about it. He was worried about not paying enough attention to external validity or generalizability, and that is something that we should be thinking about. But the third thing is something that I think is really relevant to this talk, and I'm going to use Larry's specific words, quote him. He said, we need to, quote, adapt development and evaluation methods to more complex and realistic multi-component and sequential interventions, which is like this curriculum PD. And he talked about two different methods to do this. One is called multi-phase optimization strategy, which is a little bit like what I described Heather Hill doing a lot of testing early on and building the intervention out of the pieces that showed positive effects. And the other one is called Sequential Multiple Assignment Randomized Control. The acronym is SMART. And this uses trials to build adaptive interventions. And I'm going to, another quote here, where scientists use data-based evidence to inform decision-making about how and when to alter a patient's treatment. And this is a quote that I took from the Methodology Center at Penn State. And I think that this is something really worth looking into. And I also think, Mike, that there's a very strong link between this and the, it's kind of an experimental version of Tony Brike's improvement science.
I didn't get around to talking about that.
So finally, I want to say a little bit about this idea of using proven programs in educational improvement efforts. So I totally agree that proven programs can help schools and districts solve specific problems. But I don't believe the idea of faithful implementation of a big old program is the kind of answer to school improvement. So I think it's much more like what Greg Duncan and Dick Murnane wrote about in a book a year or two ago called Restoring Opportunity. In this book, they took 4 promising approaches to educational improvement and wrote little vignettes or case studies on them. And what the common theme among all of these was that they use combinations and sort of regimens of evidence-based practices and programs rather than a single intervention. So they use evidence in a different way. They use it to guide their work rather than to tell them exactly what to do. And really importantly, they embed a lot of research and evaluation strategies into their own daily work so that they're constantly monitoring and adjusting. Okay, so in spite of some of the reservations I've laid out, I'm going to say a word in favor of the Clearinghouse because I think it's a really valuable tool to have a trusted vetter who is looking at research of programs, curricula, other interventions. After all, many of these are aggressively marketed to schools and districts as something of proven practice. And so it's great to have a place like the Clearinghouse to go to check this out. So to end, the Clearinghouse itself and the state of the art around RCTs, they're both developing, they're both improving, but I don't think that that makes them any less useful.
Thank you. Well, this is great. It's a pleasure to. I've been learning from Mike Smith for a long time, and any chance I get to be a reactor to something that he's written, I jump at the occasion. So thank you again. You have somehow managed once again to reset some of our agenda here, which I think is it's a very important moment in the history of education research, and I'm glad you did this. I'm sorry for the scratchy throat. I think I was part of an experiment in which I was randomly assigned to an airplane that had no circulating air in it. So I'm going to try not to get into a hacking cough, but if I do, my apologies in advance. For me, the key word in this, in Mike's and Alan's paper that I want to focus on a little bit in the next few minutes is this word use. It's a small word, but it carries a big burden. We've been thinking about the use of social science evidence to inform or guide or actually set public policy for quite a while. There's a literature on this, in case some people here don't know that literature or want to dig into this a little bit more. People like David Cohen and Charles Lindblom and Carol Weiss and others, and more recently, actually, the National Academy of Sciences produced a report, I think it came out in 2011, which actually has that in the title, Using Scientific Evidence for Public Policy. It was chaired by Ken Pruitt, and one of the main points in that report and in that project was to note that we spend a great deal of money in the United States asking for scientific evidence and social scientific evidence about things that matter to us, such as the quality of education and the likelihood that interventions in schooling are going to make a difference. And we don't actually have much of a theory of how that investment is to be used. How are the results of all of this research that we are buying actually, how does that research find its way into the minds and hands of the people who have to set policy? So this focus on randomized trials, I think, is an occasion for us to think about the use question. And for me, this is a good example in this paper, I think, of something that is sometimes overlooked, and that is that the statistical quality of a study ought to be at least a necessary condition for its use or its utility. But frequently, that's not enough. And in fact, there are a lot of other things that weigh on whether or not the results of any kind of study are going to be put into use, and appropriately so. So I'm not going to try to comment on any of the technical issues that Mike and Alan have raised in this paper or on other things, and I'm glad that John mentioned Larry Hedges' paper. I mean, it was a kind of tour de force of some of the most interesting advances in the statistical science of randomized trials. And I'm glad Becca comes next, and I defer to her on most of these technical questions anyway. But I want to talk about the credibility part of this, which I think is embedded in Mike and Alan's paper, and that is that even if some of these statistical issues are handled, there are still issues having to do with the credibility of the results, and that plays an important part. That influences the extent to which they are used. So I used to work at the National Academy of Sciences, and we always had a story that we told because we hoped it was an exception to prove a rule. It was a story of a study that was done now probably 40 years ago, which suggested that there was very little evidence of a link between cholesterol and heart disease, amazingly. But this was 40 plus years ago. And even then, though, when the study came out, there were eyebrows raised in the medical community and in the scientific community. And then they looked a little bit more closely, and they discovered that a few members of the panel that had produced the report actually were employed by the dairy industry. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that actually that report had the science right, at least as it was up to then. But it didn't matter because the optics were such that the results of even the scientific evidence that was produced were simply not credible because of these kinds of threats, as I think that's a nice word here. So what Mike and Alan have here are a number of threats to the use of this kind of evidence, and I think at least some of them have to do with what I call the optics of all of this. I used to dabble in econometrics and then a little bit in psychometrics, and now I'm thinking that what we really need to understand the theory of use is something I would call optometrics. If we can figure out a way to measure the likelihood that research-based results are believed and believable, and strongly enough to then warrant and to justify their use in action. And these are the kinds of things that are often overlooked, especially in a community of measurement experts, which quite rightly focuses on the statistical quality and on the data and on the technique. From Mike's list of the various threats, there are three that stand out, I think, most prominently, but I have little time here, so I'm just going to mention two that remind me of this business of the threats that come from the possibility, the possible threats associated with the optics. One is the one about the developer-associated thing. In 12 of the 27 studies, the authors had an association with the curriculum's developer. Now, I don't think that's a prima facie case that the study is flawed or that the evidence is in some way wrong or that the statistics were wrong. But it does make it less plausible from the standpoint of whether the results are going to be understood and accepted. Another one is that in 5 of the studies, the assessment was designed by the curriculum developer. Again, these are the kinds of things that, and by the way, after that experience with the cholesterol thing, the Academy got much more serious about procedures that were put into place to try to at least curb the likelihood of those kinds of biases being introduced into the process. I want to jump to some of Mike and Alan's recommendations, which I think are really interesting. I'll focus on 2, and I will add 1 or 2 friendly caveats or amendments. So yes, I think IES should review, and by the way, I'm a member of the NBES, the National Board, so what I'm saying here doesn't represent the board, it barely only represents me. Yes, so IES should review the analyses that they've done here of these mathematics curriculum studies and make judgments about their rationale and make all of that, make the judgments and the rationale for these studies public. So my amendment would be that the review should also acknowledge that analyses of curriculum interventions that don't rely on RCTs should also be subjected to some kind of a serious discussion of their standards of evidence and the credibility of the results. And I think, knowing Mike as I do, I doubt that he would reject that friendly amendment, but the counterfactual here is important. And if we all agree that social science is necessarily an imperfect science, then we're always going to be in a situation where we're trying to assess the likelihood of error, but that's true for other kinds of studies, not just the randomized trial studies. Furthermore, I would say that where they say in deciding on which ones to remove, IES or someone should take the time to develop a more complete statement of its criteria and the decision rule by which that triage actually is to be made. This would actually be an interesting assignment for some organization or group. The recommendation to have the NRC, which is no longer called the NRC, or the National Academy of Education, consider these sorts of issues. I can't argue with that logic. I'm involved with the National Academy of Education. It sounds like a reasonable thing to do, but I think that while we're at it, I would try to have the experts dig into another aspect of this question, which is whether we can develop a framework for estimating under what circumstances does it pay to make these investments in randomized trial studies, given that they are expensive. And the question is whether we expect some, marginal benefit in terms of the quality of the inferences that justify those additional costs. I don't think we've actually done that as a community. And my last point is that this metaphor of the gold standard, as a recovering economist, I have to say that the gold standard is one of the things in economics that no economist I know thinks was a good idea. So maybe we come up with something better than the gold standard.
Okay, so I have lots of things I could say, but I'm going to try to focus this so we have some time for discussion. So the first thing I want to commend Mike and Alan for a very thoughtful job examining the issues around what is in the What Works Clearinghouse. And I'm going to comment very briefly on three things. I want to talk about the decision to focus on randomized controlled trials very briefly. Then I want to talk a little bit about their framing of the qualities that are critical to the relevance of impact estimates. And then third, I want to propose what I believe is an alternative to the conclusions and the recommendations that I think takes us in a much more productive direction than going out to re-review what's in the clearinghouse and making decisions about what to excise from it. On the first point, there's nothing about randomized controlled trials nothing in this paper that is unique to randomized controlled trials as opposed to causal inference research. And so I would argue that having that in the title and having that be the focus it somehow distracts, I think, from the main message. So I would suggest that the title be something more like, do the impact evaluations included in the What Works Clearinghouse provide useful evidence for policy and practice? And so then on the issue of the qualities of the studies that matter, and I've changed the language a little bit. I think the paper is really talking about what qualities of studies matter to deciding whether or not this evidence is useful and in what conditions. And I would argue that what the What Works Clearinghouse has done is to separate the wheat from the chaff. They've basically gone out, identified all the studies that purport to generate causal inference on a particular topic, middle school math curriculum, for example. And they've surfaced all that evidence, and they have sorted into that may plausibly have credible evidence of effectiveness that would be useful to some purpose, for some purpose. Okay, which isn't to say that it's useful across the board. A study of Saxon math may be useful if that study was conducted in a setting that is similar to the setting that you are working in. It may not be relevant to you if it's conducted in another setting. It may be relevant to you even if it's outdated, if the curriculum hasn't changed much. It may not be relevant if there have been major changes in the curriculum format. It may be useful to you if you are not a school practitioner making selection decisions for the next curriculum, but rather you're a bench scientist or an education scientist who is sitting back trying to look across curriculum and try to understand curriculum are more effective under what conditions. So I would argue that there are different audiences for the evidence, and different ones of us might find different studies valuable for our purposes depending upon our particular perspective. And what the What Works Clearinghouse, I believe, has a broader mission than you appropriately, I think, quoted something that is on the website. I think I would argue that it has a much broader set of uses than being a source of information about what works for practitioners. I think it is also where a lot of others of us can go to get useful information. In the same vein, I would take issue with some of the assertions in here, and this is partly because I have this somewhat broader perspective. Fidelity of implementation, it pushes that as a study is not useful if the intervention wasn't implemented with fidelity. It might or might not be of interest to you if you want to think about what is typical practice. Then you want to know what the impact of a curriculum was as typically implemented in a school, how it would normally be implemented. Oftentimes, things are not implemented with the same fidelity in the schools as they were implemented by the developers. So there were multiple reasons that it matters whether the developers were involved. Typically, if a developer was involved, you can hold them accountable for the fidelity of implementation. They thought that's how it should be implemented. That's how they implemented it. That's how they tested it. If, on the other hand, you are a school district, think about Tennessee that just did early pre-K, universal pre-K, and they were going to do universal quality pre-K. They implemented the program, they got this evaluation results, and now there's a little bit of cry of foul play. It wasn't implemented with fidelity. That is not a good test of implementing high-quality pre-K. I think we would agree with that if it really wasn't implemented well. But it was a good test of what happens if you implement a policy, put lots of money on the stump, and engage people in implementing universal pre-K. That's as good as they could do it or did do it in that setting. And I think it's valuable to know that information. Those are you've answered two different questions there. And I want us to be careful not to throw out evidence that might be useful for one purpose because our lens is narrowly on another purpose. I think there is heterogeneity and interest here. So this is part of the use of evidence issue that Mike was referring to. The issue, similarly, I think the issue of the comparison group conditions, I think it's absolutely true that we need to know what the comparison conditions are. I don't think it's always the case that we need to have identical durations and doses of implementation, because in some situations, the intention is to have a larger dose of one curriculum than another. We're going to do a double dose math instead of a single dose math. So again, I think context matters here. I think it's important to know, but I would say it's not, I would not say that a study has no useful information just because those criteria were not matched. So I rather like relabeling all of these things that were labeled as threats or things that put studies into the not useful category as qualities that matter and that we ought to know about and we ought to describe. So with that, let me just say what I would propose as an alternative conclusion to all of this. What I would suggest is that we recast the critique into recommendations for improving the content of the What Works Clearinghouse and to set up efforts to educate practitioners, policymakers, and researchers as to how they can more effectively use the clearinghouse. And in fact, there's a lot of work underway right now to do this. In part, there wasn't a corpus of evidence large enough to warrant this until the last few years, and I think now it is time to do that. And I would say that there are 3 sources of information right now that I think you may not have been aware were there, but they're very helpful. There's a reviewed studies database, which offers a very quick way to just go and say, has there been a study of this? And is it good enough to make that basic bar, not the ultimate bar with all these other qualities checked, but is it even something I should look at? There's a studies findings database, which allows you to actually download a lot of coded information, including some of the subgroup information that is not you don't get when you go to the landing pages of these intervention reports, but you can dig down and you can find those and you can get them printed out. And it's appendices, but now you can also have it in an Excel file and you can manipulate that, which sets us up for sort of some research synthesis work down the road, cutting across interventions and so on. And that has a lot of information about target populations, et cetera. And then there's a lot of information in the appendices to practice guides and intervention reports. So there's a lot more information there that will help us out. And as I just want to say also that we are doing a much better job with study designs now, and I would say to all of you, there are things like the common evidence guidelines that were a tour de force between the Department of Education and NSF, which actually incorporates this concept of staged evaluations, moving from the improvement science to the composite interventions. And if you just look at the grant guidelines. So I think we're in a whole new space now. So I want to commend the work that you did, and I would just really encourage us thinking about the glass is half full instead of half empty. I think we've got a lot to build on, and I'd like to see it go in that direction.
great.
Thank you. I'm going to get quickly into a couple of questions. Audience here, I'm going to take questions in just a few minutes, so be ready. Mike, I wanted to start out and actually throw this out to the entire group. The WellWorks Clearinghouse is sort of premised on the idea of getting, vetting evidence and then getting useful evidence that's rigorous into the hands of decision makers so that's actually used information. And Dr. Maynard, you were talking about how some of the concerns that Mike and Alan have pointed out could be shades on that information or provided nuance. And I wonder what that tension looks like, and this is for anyone to take on, when we're trying to bridge this divide by of nuanced information that is difficult to digest, and how do we get that in the hands of decision makers who need quickly digestible information with, sometimes a minimum of expertise in how to evaluate that.
Can I
Absolutely.
offer? So one of the things that's happening right now is there are a number of efforts afoot to actually have more of a menu-driven front end to the clearinghouse, so that you can go in and sort of you can be the looking for a curriculum, or you can say, I've got somebody's giving me a study, they want me to do Saxon math. What do we know about this? And so there are ways that you can go in and bore down. You can sort of also key on things like, I'm in an urban school, I have a heavy ELL population. So the more we can sort of code these qualities and get them in there, and many of them are in there, they just have not had the front end to make them usable. If you have to actually print all these appendices and page through them online, that's hard. So I think some of it is doing more with what we have, making it more usable, and thinking about it from the putting yourself in the mindset of the end users.
Let me take that question and add a little bit to it. When you all read the paper, at the end of it, near the end of it, it has a fairly long, maybe 2-page discussion of what do you think is going to happen in the future, what should be happening in the future, and makes 3 general points. One point is that what's happened in the past has been that the tensions in the school system, the fact of having standards, of having assessments that measure those standards, and that the standards really weren't all that different among states and so on, created curriculum by publishers who wanted to sell it that looked very much the same. You couldn't step out of the boundary of a particular curriculum set of base of knowledge, the sequence of knowledge, and so on, the kinds of things that you wanted to emphasize. They had all to be the same. You could change a little bit in terms of perhaps the way that they should be implemented, or it's more focused on basic skills than on more deep kinds of problems. But these curricula really don't look very different, and you can't expect very much because of the press of the system itself. The second point is that we're entering into a new world. We're entering into a world where we're not going to have curriculum that don't change every year. I mean, you'd be an absolute fool at Pearson if you did not change your curriculum every year based on evidence about how well it's working. So the 2016 curriculum is not going to be the 2017 curriculum, which is not going to be the 2018 curriculum. They're going to change it through improvement science activities, and they're going to study, and they're going to do maybe limited RCTs to do that. But it's going to be a continuous process. The same thing is going to happen in a lot of schools. In Long Beach, California, they've had the same reading program for 10 years. Long Beach is a terrific place. These people really know how to teach reading. You know why they know how to teach reading? Because they've had the same program for years, and they've changed it, systematically changed it over time. And they've changed it as individuals and as schools and as a district. That is, as something works at an individual level. Then the school picks it up and tries it, across teachers, and then, boom, the district says, "All right, we're going to do this way." And so what you get is this continuous improvement process in Long Beach, and a different one perhaps in Fresno, and a different one perhaps in San Francisco. So your curriculum begin to change, and somehow we've got to be able to come to grips with that. And that's basically what that last section is about. The world is changing. How do we begin to adapt ourselves to that world? And I agree completely on the fidelity issue. I mean, I don't think we need fidelity. I think we need good adaptation. And the better the adaptation, the better it's going to be for the kids. So that's this is everything is different, and that's why I'd like to see a 3 or 5 year study done that really gets into these issues and sees whether or not we can do something formal with them.
Well, I want to turn it over to some questions from the audience. We have a couple of rules here at AEI during these question and answer sessions. The first is that you state your name and affiliation. The second is that you ask a question. So if it gets into a speech, we'll choose someone else.
Hi, my question is about the categories that What Works Clearinghouse uses to classify RCTs. Becca mentioned a classification that just about everybody's interested in, universal pre-K approaches in different places. I would argue that math curriculum is something that very few people outside of educational publishing are interested in. I myself, I'm George Cave of Summit Consulting. I myself am more interested in whole school reform approaches that generate excitement for a while but then are forgotten. For example, Tom Kane's Talent Development High School out in Los Angeles, or Hank Levin's Accelerated Schools, or James Comer's School Development Program. Is the What Works Clearinghouse going to shift some of its attention to these things that educators and political leaders are more interested in, rather than things like math curriculum development?
Have you ever read the literature on follow-through? Follow-through? Ever hear of follow-through?
Yes.
Okay, well, the same questions were being asked in 1970. So, they have.
So, but with respect to the clearinghouse, they do. If you go on the site, they do have a lot of topics that are in there. So they started with curriculum products as a practicality. It was well defined. But if you go on now, and they even do single study reviews. So they just did a quick review, for example, of the Tennessee pre-K study, and they'll follow up with that on a more systematic basis later. But they have a whole suite of products and a much wider range of issues, and they have a system for prioritizing what they're going to review.
Is there any indication that the What Works Clearinghouse has partially been captured by the educational publishers and other people with big money interests in educational research?
To my knowledge, no. I mean, I think that they follow their protocols, and everything is subject to, internal review, external review, and it's publicly available information. So they.
Question over here.
Yes, my name's Jim Colmus from Edge Consulting, and thank you for this great panel and great conversation. And I think there'll be many more following this one because it's such an important topic. As my good friend Vivian Sen of the William T. Grant Foundation would say, evidence is at a crossroads, and it's the result of a lot of things that you've just talked about and the good work at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Improvement Science. But a big stimulator immediately on our doorstep is the Every Student Succeeds Act, where evidence-based is mentioned 60 times and has a somewhat related definition of evidence as you've been talking about. I'm wondering what you think about ESSA and the evidence provisions and also the capacity of the field to be able to implement them.
I'm going to take that one first. That's a great question, Jim. I'm glad you read the thing closely enough to do the count on how many times evidence. 62. That's good. I think No Child Left Behind had 114 mentions of scientifically based research. And so you can decide whether we're moving in the right direction or not just by the count. But more seriously, I think you've raised a very important question, which is a lot of these decisions are now going to be, at least to some extent, devolved back to states and localities. And to the extent that their people, decision makers in those places, are going to be faced with a lot of recommendations, some coming from vendors who have a big stake in the outcome. There's going to be an increased appetite, I hope, for some credible evidence about, given the choices we have, what seems to be the most likely to succeed, whether it's a curriculum or whether it's some other kind of intervention. In that respect, I think the What Works Clearinghouse, I agree with Becca, this is an example of something that is a very important way to try to create a comfort zone for decision makers. At least you can get at least a first approximation of the stuff that you really don't want to bother considering. Yeah, of course, it's imperfect. And so this, I think, is a stimulus to all of us to take the idea of the What Works Clearinghouse and really make it even better, a little bit maybe more broadly defined, and make it useful to people in those situations. But you're quite right that the new law is going to make for an even heartier appetite for some useful information. So.
Question over here.
Nick Spiva, Education Council. So it was interesting hearing you all talk about the importance of kind of like adaptation in the schools and on the ground, in addition to fidelity, and maybe even more so than fidelity. And kind of a little bit about ESSA is that it just has certain requirements around that you're using, interventions that meet certain requirements at certain times. What could be done at the state or federal levels in the future to incentivize good adaptation, I guess? I don't even know what that likes, but does that question land with any of you?
Yeah, it takes a lot of skills and a lot of energy to systematically adapt something. What tends to happen in school systems, at least the ones that I've looked at, is that there's a feeling of adaptation, a sense that we should, let's say, add material to this product, take away parts of this product, do certain kinds of work on it. But it hasn't really, the idea of a systematic, coherent approach of the information science type is unknown to schools, to teachers, to principals, and so on. And there needs to be some way of beginning to introduce the concepts beyond the 3 or 4 dozen superintendents in the country that know what they're doing in that regard. It needs to be more than the superintendents. It needs to be the central office. It needs to be the principals that begin to carry out these kinds of activities. So I think adaptation is in the blood of people. I mean, in the blood of a good teacher. And she or he knows that certain things work, and they don't want to try things or keep practicing something that isn't working. And so it's there already, I think, and we just need somehow to make it a little more formal than we have.
I just like to add a little bit to that thought about making this more formal. I think there's a huge need and a huge appetite for these ideas of adaptation and continuous improvement, but we don't have an infrastructure for how to do it. We don't have standards for it. We don't have the kind of, we haven't put the kind of energy and effort into developing this field as science as we have into the others, and I think we need to pay attention to it.
The idea of continuous improvement is talked about a lot now. I mean, just about everything you read, there's continuous improvement. We really don't know what it is and how it fits. California is wrestling very hard with an accountability system, taking the current accountability system and turning it into a system that does somehow influence, somehow trigger, somehow motivate continuous improvement processes. But it's not easy, and you know, we haven't, as far as I know, we haven't got careful study of it going on around the country. We've got activities, people working at it, but not careful studies of it. Becca, do you have a last word? She's got to catch a train at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, our time has actually come to an end, but I wanted to thank our authors and our panelists very much. Thank you. Night. Oh, there is also there's a reception for those who can stay in the hall, so please feel free to ask questions and discuss.